Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Hernan. I'm head of Bluestack Productions, the publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine covering environmental matters on the island of Ireland. I'm very pleased today to be here in Brussels at the offices of World Vision with Deirdre de Burca. Deirdre, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Deirdre, you're the Director of Advocacy and Child Justice here at World Vision.
I am.
But you do have another background that I should mention, and that is Deirdre was a Green Party councillor for Bray, City of Bray, and for Wicklow County.
Yes.
And also appointed to the Irish Senate for the Green Party in 2007?
2007 to 2010.
2010. And then when did you join World Vision?
I joined World Vision in September last year.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been working for the organisation now for about 14 months, and before that I was working for Caritas Europa, which is another development NGO, but focused largely on Europe rather than the developing world.
Now, could you tell the audience, some of whom may or may not know the full work of World Vision, what World Vision is and what it does?
World Vision is an international NGO that works with vulnerable children and their communities around the world to help them to overcome poverty and injustice. So we basically view ourselves as a child rights organisation. We basically adopt a rights-based approach to working with these children and their families, and we do relief work, we do development work, more traditional development work, and also advocacy. So, as you mentioned, I'm the Director of Advocacy, and advocacy is probably a polite word for lobbying, which has become a bit of a debased, or at least it's acquired some baggage over the years. But advocacy is really about trying to influence the policy and practice of the main sort of actors, political actors, at an international level and also a national level. So I'm based here in Brussels. I'm on the doorstep of the European Parliament, very close to the European Commission, and a lot of the work that I and my colleagues do is about trying to engage with and influence those institutions so that the European Union's external action policies, those policies that are going to impact on children and their families in the developing world, are as positive and as pro-child and as pro-poor as possible.
So it's really so you're really focused on the EU rather than, say, the IPCC negotiations or that area of international.
Yeah, well, what's
change.
Interesting now is that more recently a big focus of my work is what are called the post-2015 framework discussions. And this is a global development framework that's going to replace the Millennium Development Goals. Now, a lot of people are familiar with the Millennium Development Goals. They were 8 very ambitious goals about tackling global poverty that were agreed in the year 2000, and they are reaching their conclusion now. The framework had a sort of a 15-year lifespan, and there's a challenge now to the global community. Well, the whole business of tackling poverty at a global level is unfinished. We need to develop a new framework, but in the meantime, a lot of the work that was done to the Rio+20 conference has started to impinge on the more traditional poverty eradication agenda. And so what's happened more recently is that this new framework that was very much looking at issues of poverty and injustice and hunger and so on has had an impetus from the Rio+20 process to include sustainable development goals. And so recently the UN and the member states of the UN have engaged in a process that has produced 17 goals that are considered, they're described as the Sustainable Development Goals, and they managed to integrate climate issues, environmental issues, and poverty and issues of poverty and injustice in the same framework. This is really positive, but one of the goals deals specifically with climate. So there are strong links to the IPCC process that's underway at the moment, to the International Climate Treaty that's going to be agreed at around the same time next year in 2015 as this post-2015 framework. So while we're not directly focused on the IPCC process and the discussions around the International Climate Treaty, we're the post-2015 framework that we're very focused on is closely linked to that. And my feeling is that when both frameworks are agreed next year, there will be clear, even financing links between the two. So in other words, that maybe some of the finance that is mobilised at an international level for the implementation of the climate treaty will also feed into somehow or influence the implementation of the post-2015 framework.
And so you're taking on the EU and the UN at the same time, in other words.
I suppose you could say that.
Now, how big is World Vision? How many offices do you have and staff members across the world?
We operate in almost 100 countries around the world, 97 at the moment, and we have 45,000 staff. We have a policy of hiring local staff, so if we operate in a particular country, we tend to hire local people to work in our organisation. So we're very much a grassroots-based organisation in the countries that we're working in, and we work in a slightly different way from a lot of other organisations. I mean, World Vision is very well known, particularly in the United States, where it's very strong, for having pioneered a child sponsorship model. So basically, people, sponsor children through the organisation. But we don't adopt a sort of an individual approach to the children we're working with in the developing world. We work on an area basis. So what we do is we go into a particular area in a developing country, and we work with the population of that area, and we make a commitment to working with the people of the area for a 15-year period, because we realised from previous experience that when NGOs go into an area and do short-term work, maybe over a couple of years, and then withdraw, they haven't the time, or the local community aren't able to embed the learning and so on, so that the project becomes sustainable in the longer term. So we make a longer term commitment. We work with not just with specific groups, we work with the entire community with a focus on children. And as I say, we work in many different parts of the world. It's hard to think of a region of the world where World Vision isn't very well represented.
Now, one of the things I wanted to talk with you in particular is the relationship between climate change and developmental aid, which seems to be a very changing world for developmental aid. So we've talked with Mary Robinson and her climate justice, and with people from Oxfam. And do you see in World Vision that this climate change is impinging, is entering into the work, and in what ways is it doing that?
Very definitely. I mean, it's very interesting for me, having come from a green background, a more environmentally focused background, where sustainability was key to the green agenda. To now see the development community embrace this concept of sustainability. And part of the reason for that is that climate change has begun to impact on a lot of developing countries in a very clear, very tangible way, and a very negative way. And so development NGOs can't ignore this any longer. So in the past, I think development organisations tended to work in a kind of a compartmentalised way. We do development, that's tackling poverty and injustice. The environmentalists do the environment, and somebody else worries about the economic. I think now everything is becoming much more joined up and integrated in terms of how we approach the problems that we witness in the developing world. And I think a lot of development NGOs have realised there's no point in working on issues of poverty and injustice if climate change is beginning to impact on these people. And these are communities that have contributed so much less to the problem of global climate change than the communities of the global north. So therefore, more and more the language of sustainability, some of the concepts that were much more rooted in an environmental agenda, are being embraced by the development community. So I would say certainly World Vision was an organisation that considered it had nothing, that its work did not encompass the any environmental issues or climate issues even, until the last couple of years. And now our work has started to embrace things like disaster risk reduction and also building resilience. And these are all concepts that are very linked to climate change and the negative impacts on developing countries.
It's interesting, Deirdre, that one of the things that we're discovering is that the insurance companies, I never thought I would say anything nice about insurance companies, but they really do get climate change. And they are now requiring any kind of risk assessment for the future and the cost of that to build in the changes from climate change. So if you're funding a project in an isolated community, are you beginning to incorporate kind of climate plans or changes that you anticipate happening?
We definitely are, and I suppose one of the good things about the EU is the EU has also, led the way in terms of a lot of, it provides funding for climate-related projects and activities. World Vision hasn't always drawn down that kind of funding. We have tended to access the more traditional sources of development funding, but the EU's own development fund aid or overseas development aid is changing and is incorporating this climate-related dimension. So we are being assisted, I suppose, in helping communities now, and we do very much encourage communities to look at long-term planning, because it's clear that for a lot of, particularly smallholder farmers and so on, we do a lot of work in the area of agriculture, that unless they start planning for the longer term, they're going to see their crop yields diminish every year. They're not going to be putting in place the kind of systems that will help them to cope with some of the changes that are being wrought by climate change.
We know that the peoples of the small islands, low islands, know they're going to get wiped out by climate change.
Yeah.
Are you finding that people in the interiors of African or developing countries are aware of climate change in a way?
Very definitely. I was very encouraged. I attended one of the UN meetings around this post-2015 framework last December in New York. It was in the UN headquarters, and I attended a meeting by the small island developing states. They have grouped together and they're very aware how vulnerable they are, and they're looking for support from the global community. And so they are, organising themselves and pushing their issues very strongly, and they have support from other, African states who perhaps aren't quite as much in the front line as they are in terms of the impacts of climate change, but recognise the special situation of the small island developing states. So I would say there's a lot of solidarity on the African continent from other African states for those states. And they're not all African. I mean, you have states in Asia and the Pacific that are very vulnerable to climate change also. But I think there is a growing awareness because they're managing more and more to organise themselves effectively and to put their issues right up there on the international agenda.
Now, speaking of putting their issues right up there with the international agenda, one of the things that seems to be complicating discussions about developmental aid and funding sources for it is the climate change issue, because in some ways you're asking people to give money for developing countries, and some of us in the background are saying, and by the way, it's your fault for doing that. So how do you manage that much more complicated, nuanced conversation that you probably need to have?
Yes, it is a difficult one, because I think in the past, when development organisations like World Vision were fundraising, it was largely based on a kind of a charitable model. Be good, put your hand into your pocket. These people in the developing world are living in very poor and difficult conditions. And the change that's happened in terms of the way that development is now viewed means that we have moved from that sort of charity model to a much more rights-based model, where we see that a lot of things that the global north has done has contributed to and exacerbated the problems of the global south, and therefore we do have a sense of historical responsibility, but also responsibility today for the conditions in which a lot of people in the developing world live. And climate change is one of those very obvious ways in which the lifestyles, and particularly the energy intensive lifestyles of people in the global north, impact directly and contribute to the kind of climate related problems that people in the developing world are experiencing. Next year, 2015, is what's called the European Year of Development, and there's going to be a big emphasis on trying to raise the awareness of the European public as to the links between how we live our lives in Europe, how we organise our economies and so on, and how people live in the developing world. And I think that could be done in a much more discursive and way where we exchange information, ideas, opinions and so on, and hopefully encourage people to become aware of that link, in a way that's not going to make them feel guilty, and therefore perhaps to try to deny or run away from some of the implications of the way they live their lives, but instead to develop a much stronger sense of solidarity and a willingness maybe to try and think about how we can work at changing the way we live and we organise our lives and our economies in the north, so that people get a better chance of a decent life in the global south.
It's so hard to end a conversation about environmental matters on a positive note, so I think I will stop right now. But thanks for talking with us, Deirdre.
You're very welcome.